Hi everyone, my name is Hayden Alexander Butcher. Welcome back to Hang and Vibe. We're getting close to the end of winter, only 2 episodes left, and I'm doing my best to get caught up, but I still have a few episodes I need to finish editing. But this week, Jonathan preached on 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 15 through chapter 17, verse 29. And the theme of this passage is plans. Everyone in this passage has a plan, but the only plan that comes together is God's plan. So first we see Ahithophel, who's advising Absalom on how to defeat David. And the question we ask is, why is it that God allows wicked men like Ahithophel to succeed in their plans sometimes? And the reason in this case is that God's plan is to use Ahithophel's advice to discipline David. When David sinned with Bathsheba, God told him that this would result in all kinds of turmoil within his family, and specifically one of the things that God had foretold David was that someone would sleep with his wives in the sight of all of Israel. And that is what Ahithophel's advice to Absalom was. He advised him to do this in order to basically assert dominance by sleeping with David's concubines in the public eye. And from Ahithophel's perspective, his reason for doing so was to humiliate David and to strengthen Absalom's followers. But from God's perspective, the purpose of this was to discipline David for his sin with Bathsheba. And we see a little bit of theology here in the difference between God's prescribed will versus God's decreed will. And Absalom is clearly going against God's prescribed will. It was told in God's law that this was not a good thing to do. But just because Absalom is violating God's prescribed law doesn't mean that he is going against God's decreed will, because it was God's will for this to happen. And of course, that doesn't mean that Absalom is off the hook. He still sinned and he still did a wicked thing. But it's not like he was doing anything that God didn't already predestine him to do. And we're getting a foretaste in the character Ahithophel of the eventual betrayal by Judas. When David was betrayed by Ahithophel, because Ahithophel was originally David's advisor, but he switched sides and betrayed him and basically sold him out to Absalom. And this is exactly what Judas did to Jesus. And when this happened to David, he wrote Psalm 41, which is all about Ahithophel and his betrayal. But Psalm 41 was quoted by Jesus in reference to Judas. And another interesting comparison between Ahithophel and Judas is that in the end, they both ended up hanging themselves. So there's a very clear comparison between the character of Ahithophel and the character of Judas. And also in both instances, they were both doing God's decreed will, even though they were violating his prescribed will. But God doesn't always allow wicked men's plans to come to fruition, as we see in Ahithophel's second piece of advice to Absalom. And his second piece of advice was for Absalom to let him lead the charge and hunt down David and kill him. But This time, instead of taking Ahithophel's advice, Absalom seeks a second opinion, and he ends up getting advice from Hushai, who is the spy that David planted in order to thwart Absalom's plans. And what Hushai advises is for Absalom to lead the charge and to go out and go to battle with David's and his army, so that Absalom would receive the glory instead of Ahithophel. And he plays to Absalom's pride, because he knows that Absalom would want to be seen by the people going out in glorious battle and defeating the king. And as we'll see in the next chapter, this ends with Absalom's demise. And that is what God's plan was, and that was why God allowed Absalom to take the advice of Hushai. And we see God's providence in this. It's kind of random that Absalom even sought a second opinion in the first place, because he was so willing to go with Ahithophel's advice the first time, and it worked out so well for him. So why did he seek a second opinion? There kind of is no reason. If you were to ask Absalom why didn't he go with Ahithophel's advice, he would probably say, I have no idea. It was just kind of random. But from God's perspective, it was not random at all. It was his preordained plan for this to happen, because God is sovereign over all things all the time. In the evening, Jonathan preached on Psalm 6, which is another psalm of lament, but more specifically, it's what's called a penitential psalm, because what we see here is that David is weeping and crying, and the reason he is so distraught is because of his own sin. And he is mourning over his sin, and he's fearful because he knows that he has sinned against God and that he deserves God's judgment. And Jonathan makes the point that the biggest problem that we will ever face in this life is God. If you think about it, the biggest threat in your life is judgment from God. And that should be the thing that we fear most. All of the troubles that we face have their source in God's wrath. All the problems that we face in life are a result of God's wrath towards our sin. And yet, in this passage, we see that even though David is aware that God is his biggest threat, he also is aware that God is the answer to all of his troubles. And so he goes to God with his sorrow and his fear, because he knows that God is the only one that can answer his troubles. And the grounds on which David bases his petition to God to help him is primarily for the sake of his steadfast love. He knows that he is worthy of condemnation and wrath, but he also knows that God has promised to be a loving God and a forgiving God, and so he prays that God would help him for the sake of his steadfast love. And while that's the primary reason, the secondary reason that David pleads for God's help is because David knows that nobody can praise God from the grave. And so it's for the sake of God's worship that he asks God to help him, because he knows that God is worthy of praise, and David wants to praise him. He knows that if God condemns him to hell, then he will not be able to praise God the way he wants to and the way he ought to. So those were the sermons for this week. And the other life update I have for this week is that I might be moving in the next month or two. As I mentioned on this podcast, back in November, my grandma, my dad's mom, passed away. And she willed her house to both my dad and my dad's brother. And my dad has been trying to sell the house, but he decided that if possible, it would be better for the house to stay in the family, because the house has been in our family for generations. Like, my grandma bought the house pretty much right when she and my grandpa got married. It was the first house she lived in after her parents' house, and she lived in that house for her whole life. And my dad grew up there, and my sister and I grew up going there all the time. And now that she's gone, it's like, we don't really want to sell the house to someone else, because it's been our house for so long. So my dad asked if I would want to buy the house, and I said I would. So right now he just has to figure out how we can make that possible. First thing he's going to have to do is basically pay my uncle for the half that belongs to him. And then once the house is fully my dad's, then he can basically like rent it to me for a while. And then eventually, when it becomes affordable for me to buy it, then I can buy it from him. So that's the plan right now. He's going to find out tomorrow from a lender whether that's actually going to be possible. So I'll have an update on that next week. But I hope it works out, because it is a nice house and it's in a really nice neighborhood. So if I can move there, I'd be pretty happy. But I do have to sell my current house. And in order to do that, I am going to have to do a lot of work on it, because there are some issues with my current house that will need to be worked on before it's able to be sold. So I'll have more updates on that as well in the future. But yeah, right now, there's just a lot of work that needs to be done. So that's what I'm going to be trying to focus on this month, and potentially next month as well. But yeah, that's the big news for this week. And again, it's still kind of up in the air, but I hope it works out. Alright, for the artists this week, the first one is Fleet Foxes. This is a band from Seattle, Washington, and this has become one of my favorite bands. I just find myself loving pretty much everything they do. But I picked 10 songs to talk about. The first couple are from the album Sun Giant, and the musicians in this album are Robin Pecknold. He's the lead vocalist and he plays guitar. Skylar Skjelset is also on guitar and does some they all do vocals, actually. Casey Westcott is piano and keyboards. Christian Wargo plays bass and guitar. And then Nicholas Peterson is on drums. The first track is called English House. This one just has some lovely guitar, some beautiful chord progressions. I really like the part, the "Whoa, my love" part.
Whoa, my love. Whoa, my love.
And then the next track is called Mykonos. This is probably one of their more famous tracks. And it has a pretty nice sound for the first half. The real jewel of this track, though, is the second half. It kind of switches up. It has some beautiful vocal harmonies and like a lovely Wild West kind of sounding guitar riff.
You
Restlessness Blues is the album they released in 2011. Robin Pecknold is back on vocals and a bunch of other instruments. Skylar Skelset also on guitar and other instruments. Casey Westcott is back on piano. Christian Wargo on bass. There's also a Morgan Henderson who plays bass. And then different drummer this album, Josh Tillman, is on drums. First track I want to talk about is called Bedouin Dress. This one is a pretty upbeat, has a very danceable beat. There's a very pretty violin line by a violinist named Alina Toe. And there's another part with some very pretty strings and some very pretty guitar as well. Simsalabim is another great track. This one has a very adventurous sound, some nice vocal harmonies, and there's some cool tambourine in some parts too.
Then the earth shook, that was all that it took for the train to break. All the loose.
And then this track just has an awesome fast-paced outro. Lorelei is also a good track. This one has a nice 3/4 time signature.
I knew why. Often it's hard to just sweet talk.
It has a pretty vocal melody, especially the old news part.
Old news to you then.
And then the album Crack Up, they released this in 2017. Pretty much has all the same musicians on this one, except the drummer. But I love the song Kept Woman on this. This one has a nice piano and guitar and just some incredible vocal harmonies.
Oh, and I know you'll be bolder than me. I was high, I was unaware.
And then the title track is really good, Crack Up. This one has some very beautiful vocal harmonies. There's some nice trumpets that come in. The album lists the Westerlies on horns, and this includes Andy Clausen, Willem de Koch, Zubin Hensler, and Riley Molokar.
In a midnight sun, doesn't look like
The drums pick up at one point and just sound really powerful.
when the world is
And then there's some cool woodwinds at the end. And then Shore is an album they released in 2020. I just discovered that two of the artists from Grizzly Bear are actually featured in this album. In the song Can I Believe You, Christopher Bear from Grizzly Bear did the drums. And this track just has a lovely guitar riff.
Can I believe you? Can I believe you?
I love the guitar transition when it transitions to the other parts of the song. And then the last track by them I want to talk about is called Cradling Mother, Cradling Woman. Again, drums by Christopher Bear. And this one has guitar and piano by Daniel Rosin. And there's some cool horns in the background as well. I think the Westerlies were on this one as well. this lovely, kind of somewhat simpler section that sounds a little bit quieter.
And I feel warm, but the air is clean. And my clothes are torn, but it's right on me. Passing. On the mountain top.
And the next artist I want to talk about is called the Oh Hellos. This is a sibling duo, Tyler and Maggie Heath from San Marcos, Texas. I want to talk about 4 EPs they released. The EPs are named after the Greek gods of wind, called the Anemoi. Each Greek god corresponds with a cardinal direction, north, south, east, and west. The first one is called Notos, which is the god of the south wind. First song is called On the Mountain Tall. This one has some lovely vocal melodies and some really pretty banjo and violin.
I know you want me to be afraid.
There's a energetic second verse which has some group vocals. And a really nice chorus as well. And then Constellations from this album is really good. This one has a beautiful vocal melody with some nice banjo.
In line with cedar, but the words fall flat like cymbals crashing.
I love the chorus of this one too.
It's like constellations, a million years away. Every good intention, every good.
And then there's a beautiful violin melody after the chorus.
All that's left.
This one also builds up to a cool, upbeat, fast-paced section. The next EP is called Eurus, which is the Greek god of the east wind. First track is called O Sleeper. This one has a nice flute intro and a beautiful melody in the banjo. Then there's some lovely acoustic guitar picking in the verse.
Awakening me from a dream, I see the moonlight steal across my sheet.
And then the vocals follow the melody of the banjo from the intro.
So to fill every valley below, to the pain.
And some cool violins come in. And they transition to a cool, energetic section.
But like the sun that turns the sky, illuminating all in time.
And then there's some more cool violins and some powerful drums, as well as some nice background vocals. Hieroglyphs is another good track from this EP. Very cool group vocals.
Stamping your heels along with the drum, praying the serpents underneath one of them, like there's some villain left to defeat.
It's a pretty section with some cool whistles. And it's just a very energetic track overall.
Take credit and dust. Oh, maybe so can
third EP is called Boreas, which is the Greek god of the north wind. I love the song Cold from this one. This one has some cool banjos and a cool vocal melody.
When you keep your limits like virgin snow, like a blanket of white unbroken by the soil below.
And then there's a beautiful violin section. And some nice chords in the last section of the song.
Would atrophy have for me the heart of gold? I'm not quite ready to turn to bone.
And Glowing from this EP is also really good. This one has a very pretty chord progression.
No ice walls, no frozen firmament to clearly.
There's a lovely melody in the instrumental part. And then a nice beat comes in the second verse section.
The wells of prophecy and cartography.
And then lastly is the EP Zephyrus, which is the west wind. The title track Zephyrus is really cool, has some cool violin and banjo melody in the instrumental part. And then there's some lovely background vocals towards the end. And the last track is maybe one of their best. It's called Soap. This one just is an excellent track. Has a nice upbeat sound and a nice melody.
With a molecular rift you can't fix. But I swear with all your burnt bridges, you can leach what's caustic and find a rudimentary.
I love the not quite ready line, the melody in that part.
Oh no, I think I'm not quite ready to let you circle the drain. All the things we've broken.
And there's just some awesome, powerful vocals in the chorus.
I think that you're worth keeping around. I think you're worth holding on to.
No bonus tracks this episode, but I am excited to say that I might finally be caught up with the editing. If I can get this episode out this week, then I will be fully caught up. And next week will be another episode with Jeremy Morris, and hopefully Mike and Ben can join me as well. We're going to talk about some pretty unique songs of his, so be sure to stay tuned for that one. And yeah, that'll be the last episode of winter, and then we'll be finally moving on to the spring season. So I hope you've been enjoying the podcast, and hope you'll continue to listen. As always, check out the Spotify playlist in the description, and of course, check out more songs by these artists, because they have so many good songs, both of them. So with that, everyone have a good week, and I'll see you next time.